Morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Suresh Nithirajan, Associate Professor in the Animal Sciences Department at Wageningen University. Today we are going to talk a bit about how sensors technology and artificial intelligence can provide new ways of measuring emotions in farm animals such as dairy cows and dairy cattle. So first of all, we need to understand what's an emotion. Especially in farm animals, when we look at the word emotion, we still rely on the human psychology. We depend on the definition of Paul Ekman and other researchers in understanding, exploring what constitutes an emotion. How do we go about looking at the different nitty-gritty details and the nuances involved in the word emotion? So we can, from a scientific perspective, we can look at this as a biochemical change, or even the word emotion, energy in motion, how the energy changes over a period of time in the body in different forms. That can also be considered as an emotion. So when I use the word energy, we have to take into account the biochemical, the physiological, the behavioral, and the other related indicators in totality of the energy. So we also have to take into account the feeling component. So it's not just the gross level biochemical composition change. For example, if the animal goes through a specific stress or fear or pain, then we tend to measure in the form of a cortisol or oxytocin or a specific neuroendocrine chemical. So those specific chemical changes, of course, indicates what's happening in that particular moment in the body of the animal, but not necessarily they are related to the valence. So how do we go about taking into account the feeling component of the emotions? That's quite crucial. So if we look at currently, there are about 70 billion animals are worldwide. So there is a public concern for animal welfare is growing tremendously. Scientific evidence in the past few years clearly shows that, like humans, animals also goes through many kinds of emotions. For example, frustration, sometimes they experience joy, fear, etc. So that cannot be disagreed. We have clear scientific evidences supporting that. But the affective state also responds rapidly to physiological state and events in the external environment. So it's a very high sensitive indicator of the animal well-being. But of course, animals cannot express emotions like the way we do, because verbally we communicate and animals cannot do that. But they have vocalizations through the different ways of changing the modulation. They do communicate with others with its own cough, but we are not yet there to quantify it, to measure it. So we are still looking at the iceberg indicators in terms of looking at how the emotions expresses and manifests itself in animals. For example, in addition to vocalization, we also know the body and the tail movement. We also rely on that. Sometimes the facial expressions of these dairy cows, the orbital tightening, how the snout gets tightened, what's the change in the eye, whether the eye becomes so bigger, what is the posture of the ear. Those are also some of the cues that tells us the mood or the actual emotions of the cows. So along with these behavioral signals, we could also look at the other physiological parameters. For example, the change in the heart rate, the respiration rate, how the temperature changes, either in the snout region or in the vaginal region, how rapidly the loss of temperature, thermoregulation happens. Those are also certain cues that tells us how the body of the dairy cattle modulate the biochemical signals. There is also, when we measure the saliva or the blood-based measurements such as lactate, cortisol, or the oxytocin, they also can tell us a little bit about what's happening in terms of the emotions. So when we traditionally, the way we measure emotions is we send a questionnaire to the animal caretakers and the stock managers and look for certain indirect indicators, how the hygiene is happening. A primary focus is being currently given only on the negative emotions, whether there is any pain is being experienced by the animal, fear, or any possibility of injury that could affect the emotions. So focus is primarily on the negative aspects, not so much on the positive aspects, that is how do we enrich the quality of the life, how do we introduce playful behavior for the dairy cattle, the natural behavior, how do we go about changing things in the environment, in the stable, in the farm, to allow the animal to experience its own unique state. So there's still more room to understand the positive behaviors, positive emotion, and the positive balance that has to be fully explored. So we are not yet there, still in the very nascent initial stages of understanding the left brain and the right brain, the hemisphere of the brains of the dairy cattle using behavioral inhibition or the activation system methodologies. So how does the animal, whether the animal try to react or proactive, whether it can flight or fight or freeze when an external stimuli is being introduced. For example, the stimuli could be as simple as suddenly opening an umbrella at a nearest distance and observing how the dairy cow or the cattle is behaving, or creating a lighting situations in an enclosed stable, and just the shadow or a noise, a predator noise, how that causes a specific change in terms of this fight, flight, or freeze system. And then we go about quantifying and measuring these different emotional systems. So when we, realistically speaking, we are in 2022, many groups in Europe here, and of course in the United States and other countries have been looking at it. There is a recent study about toilet training the cattle. Can we be able to toilet train so that they go to a specific zone, and maybe it's associated to greenhouse methane emissions? How do we modify the behavior as a food reward and other techniques? People have also looked at the cow-calf contact. For example, the social network analysis, the social health of these animals. When we know from our group also, we have looked at this, when the dairy cow is going to give birth to a calf, it needs its own privacy. It demonstrates that through a certain vocalization and a certain body movement, unique body movement, wagging of the tail. It tries to create a boundary during the calving period. It doesn't like to be disturbed. I'm using the word it, but actually she. But the cow also, we know that demonstrates the maternal dominance in a passive-aggressive way by licking behavior, aggressive licking on her own calf, through visually demonstrating through the neighbor cows that, hey, this is my call, this is my kid, back off. So they try to communicate that through a specific unique behavior. So this activation versus inhibition system with respect to specific context and specific scenario or environmental stimuli still needs better understanding and better exploration. There are many benefits of studying emotions, especially in dairy cattle. We know that a happy cow is a productive cow. The milk tastes really better. From the production perspective, the meat of the beef, the quality and the longevity, the shelf life you can store, that's also way better if the animal has gone through a nurtured, happy life during the shorter period in which the animal lives. There are also concepts like micro expressions and macro expressions. In the human beings, micro expressions has evolved quite a bit. Just a 1 minute video clip to show what are those micro expressions.
Johnny English.
Virtual action coding system. High-speed cameras recording multiple expressions invisible to the naked eye. They can be called emotional leakage.
With someone I'm a trader. I did.
Take you back to Mozambique. Take a look at this. Take you back to Mozambique.
So in the human biomedical sector, the facial action coding system or the biometric technologies or the facial recognition technologies have evolved quite a bit. There are also, news reports recently in Taiwan and Shanghai. People are already using some of these technologies to see how the children, whether they are learning or paying attention in the classroom. Some of the employment companies, private industries, they also use some of these technologies during the hiring process, whether the potential future employee is saying the truth or it's a little bit far from the truth, using these micro expressions cues. They have split-second changes in tiny little, for example, a blink of an eye at a fraction of 1/6 of a second, how fast they change. The smirk, based on the slightest change in the angle or the action units, closer between the upper and the lower lip. So very, very subtle way of determining the emotions has evolved in the human biomedical arena. But we cannot directly translate these human biomedical technologies to animals because it's quite challenging, first of all. Animals, they do not have muscles. So it's very hard to equally translate and adapt the human technology to determine these. So the technology development has to be from the scratch, and we need to correlate and measure to create a benchmark, because there is absolutely no benchmark available in terms of the animal emotions, at least for farm animals yet. So we also need to understand concepts like digital phenotyping. Many of us nowadays wear smart watches, or at least we have the smartphones that can do more things. So these moment by moment data collected from our own body can tell many signatures, many stories about us, how the mood changes. If our lunchtime get delayed for 45 minutes, those kind of, and then what are the best time for us to focus in terms of getting things done, enhancing the productivity based on the biochemical changes, the changes in the heart rate. Those kind of information can be easily determined using wearable technologies. But can these be used for animals? Right now, of course, dairy cattle, they wear ear tags. They also have a neck collar. Some of them, they even wear a moo call to measure, to predict the calving based on some of those tail-based wearable devices. So the observable set variables that these animals displays based on either interacting with the environment or interaction among themselves, they provide unique information on the health, welfare, the production, and sometimes the indirectly linked to the profitability if we consider that. So the biggest question we are trying to address is the difference between the gross level versus the subtle level. To be able to understand these micro expressions, the subtle changes of the behavior manifestation due to these changes in emotions need to be quantified. So these wearable devices comes in handy really well to be able to see the minute by minute data change or even second by second data change. So this digital phenotyping technology can be easily applied to animals to understand their true capacities. So for example, species-specific traits. So we can access the phenotypes for tailoring efficiently and accurately. Sometimes the devices also allow for the information that can easily and better inform the farmers related to unique aspects of animal welfare and production that potentially needs improvement. So by understanding the individual animal and also the mental physiological needs, the sensor-based digital phenotyping can serve as an effective intervention platform. So along these lines, we also have to take into account per animal quantification versus herd level and flock level. You know, when we look at the chicken poultry industry, decisions are being made in flock level, but more or less the same scenario in dairy animals also. If there are, 500 to 1,000 cows in a commercial farm, veterinarian, when he or she steps in, they make a decision typically not per animal, but also for the per herd animal. Irrespective of the body condition scoring, they make certain recommendations. Sometimes the dosages are common for all the animals, irrespective of the subtle individual differences between these animals. So how do we go about understanding and determining the emotions per animal using some of these technologies, biometric applications, so that we know, oh, this is Jane, that's Lotus, she is Jessica. So we can individually understand the personality of each of those animals and cater to those needs so that the welfare can be better enhanced. So those possibilities are also feasible at this moment using some of these sensor technologies. For example, the gait pattern. When I walk, I have a certain body mass index. My gait is unique compared to maybe another person with my similar height and weight. So it's the case with cows. When we put the cameras and measure the unique walking ability and the pattern associated, we can say this is Jane, that's Austin, so on and so forth, and cater to the individual needs accordingly. So how do we unpack the happiness as a key in terms of enhancing the adaptation to stress? So we have to consider another concept, resilience. So to visualize the concept of resilience, maybe I ask you to imagine, see a elastic band. You stretch a band, then if you leave it, the elastic band comes to its original state. Similarly, when we keep on giving a stress to these animals, how quickly these animals come back to the pre-stressful conditions after it's exposed to not so favorable environmental stimuli or conditions. So the time it takes for the animal to process the stimuli and then come back to its natural state is crucial, because they are connected to the way the emotions is being processed by the animal, but also have implications in the later stages of the life. So the most happy, enriched quality of life in the early stages of life have implications in the later adult life of these animals. So we have proof. Currently, some transgenerational studies are also being conducted. How from one generation, some of the traits can be passed on to the next generation of the animal in terms of the emotions. What kind of sensations, what is the motivation behind this processing of these makeup of the mental capacities of these animals? Those kind of studies are also happening to better understand and explore the emotional approaches. So right now, only few groups are looking at using these emotions as a potential possibility to enhance welfare. But those research groups across the world, they're also looking at certain aspects. It's like out of 360 degree, only 20 or 15 degrees are being looked at. It's not complete holistic perspective. To be able to get a better holistic perspective, a systems approach need to happen. For that systems approach, we need to use a multimodality way of measuring the emotions. So we looked at the heart rate, respiration rate, skin temperature changes, blood or saliva level changes in the cortisol, lactate, and oxytocin, ear posture, orbital tightening, eye white, body movement, wagging of the tails. So how do we develop something that can measure all of these parameters into one package so that we can get a holistic 360-degree view of the emotions and thereby the behavior, and thereby we create interventions and decision support systems and welfare platforms and so on. So that's the focus that we have been working on here in Wageningen University. So of course, we take into account the facial expressions of these animals, the sound, vocalization data, activity, what side, whether they are lying mostly on the left side of the body or right side of the body, how long they are sitting and how long they are resting. Right after feeding, how quickly they go to rest and how they come back to activity. What is the frequency of lameness? What are the different composition of gases that's coming from the gut through the nasal, and how the composition changes? Can we be able to do a sniffer analysis to understand not just the methane, but also those odor volatile microsignatures to provide to understand the telltale signs of the mental makeup of these animals? Of course, the heart rate and heart rate variability, the skin temperature changes, acceleration data, and so on and so forth. So it's a huge amount of real-time, continuous big data streaming off from these animals at a time. So when we put these gadgets in a non-invasive, preferably in a contactless way, using camera technologies, we collect these data. So now we have this data coming. We need to do pre-processing the data, cleaning, denoising, and then we have heterogeneous. Some is audio, some is video, some is number, some is activity. So how do we create a pooling, a principal component analysis of these multiple variety of heterogeneous complex multiplexing of data, multimodality of the data, and then derive insights to understand the mental makeup, the behavior, and the adaptation, resilience capacity of these animals. So that's the end goal, to be able to achieve it, we have to do baby steps. So that's where we are looking at. Currently, we are going from just one sensor to 5 different sensing technologies, along with imaging, and then slowly building on to sound in the process of creating digital twins, a virtual reality or a metaverse of these dairy cows and pigs. So it's a very complex framework. We use what we call artificial intelligence based some support vector machine algorithms to do this. For example, we also are currently looking at pooling the data in terms of the respiration activity with brain activity. We put a little gadget in a non-invasive form and measure through the electrodes which part of the brain goes faster, is it the right brain or the left brain? What is the predominant laterality that's happening? We also measure the temperature changes at the ear base, right ear base and the left ear base, because they are directly connected to the hemisphere, right and left hemisphere of the brain, using thermal imaging, and then we extract the futures, and then we, using these algorithms, we select only few futures to understand that. Then a certain stimuli is being given, opening an umbrella at a faster speed, startle the animal, or a specific sound in a louder way in the form of a predator in a non-invasive way. And then we collect the data before and after, how quickly they return to the pre-stress conditions. We also collect saliva to look for cortisol, lactate, cut the hair of the animal, look some of those signatures for correlating, like a reference check, cross-validation, and then create some of these analysis in a recognition data analysis framework. So there are some of the studies currently being designed from us and also from others, the psychological, behavioral, and biological. How do we pool all of these together? For example, the panting rate towards a thermoregulation right after feeding. If there is a subtle change in the panting rate, in a specific context, how do we correlate that information to either a aggression or a psychological mental state? So much more. It's not one person's expertise can play a role. We need ethologists, animal behavior scientists, immunologists, reproduction people. So many experts have to come together in cooperation with bioengineering people to be able to say something in a scientifically backed manner about these assessment of welfare via emotions. So some of the paradigm, for example, even in the human arena, although the emotion recognition and even prediction technologies is advanced, quite controversial. People say it's not a trait, it's a state. Emotion is a state, it is not a trait. In a specific context, in a specific time point, that manifestation of the energy in motion, emotion happens, and it suddenly changes. So because of the time series data, the changes in terms of the context, there is a possibility of biasness if you put automated technologies that constantly measures the different aspects of these emotions. Then that's a little bit tricky. We have to be very careful in doing that. For example, let me give you an example. If a fly or a mosquito sits on the ear of the cow, and the cow naturally, moves the ear or the head, then the camera would say, okay, aggression, now it's disappointed, frustration. It may false positively, it may predict. So we have to take into account what context the data is being collected. So the cow is basically flipping its ears or changing the head. So there are also other ways to overcome this. So there is a bit of manual involvement needed to correlate for the futuristic potential of automating some of these technologies. It's a little bit down the road. For that, we need more ethograms, more manual verification, more benchmarks are absolutely needed that are possible via some of the tests. It could be an attention bias test, memory bias test, judgment bias test. We know that logically and intuitively, based on our experience, some of the dairy cattle, they have what we call as a spatial intelligence. So they tend to do a certain behavior only in that particular zone of the stable at the same time. Every day they go and do the same thing at the same time. So they have an intelligence to recognize the space. Sometimes when you show a mirror in front of an animal, there is a possibility that they can check on its own body. Oh, it's my ear, my body, my nose. So how far that advancement has developed, how far we as human beings have the capability to measure the ability to sense this intelligence by these animals through cognitive bias testing, or some ways we could understand the emotional makeup of these animals. So along these lines, I want to show you a platform, a methodology, artificial intelligence tool we have developed to measure emotions for cows and pigs. I labeled this as WUR-WOLF. WUR stands for Wageningen University and Research. Wolf is the mascot of the Wageningen University. So it's a WUR-WOLF facial coding platform for measuring emotions in cows and pigs. So it relies on 3 or 4 features. One is the ear posture. Second one is the eye white region, of course, orbital tightening. So we are looking at doing the version 2 of the software so that we can integrate vocalization and skin temperature to build on. But we have the basic fundamental tool available to do this. So why we do, the idea here is, can we be able to distinguish animals? If there are thousands of animals, can we be able to name them, recognize them independently so that we can cater to individual needs, farm animal biometrics? So the social health of these animals, can we be able to introduce playful behavior, much more enriched quality of life through understanding of emotions? That's also a bigger goal. Another one is sometimes there is a cannibalistic behavior, aggression happens. How do we make interventions by changing certain parameters in the environment? It could be spacing, it could be humidity, temperature, or change in the nutrition component of the feed so that we can avoid, can we be able to predict the behavior even before that happens? Or can we be able to stimulate model behavioral pattern for these animals? How do we understand the social network analysis in terms of those interaction among their own peers? Those kind of assessments and interventions can happen using some of these tools. So based on a series of literature for the past 10 to 15 years, extensive literature review, and also based on our own data set and some experiments, we know that if a posture of the ear is in certain way, in relation to the ear, in relation to the orbital tightening, at a particular context, then there is a certain probability we could say that the animal is going through specific mood, a specific emotion. So again, it's not like a black and white. We have to always consider the context associated in determining the mood of these animals through permutation, combination, and mixing of some of these multiple parameters together. So it's a lot of data we collected from many farms for both pigs and cows. We used 3 different algorithms. It's a YOLO V3, V4, and V4, V5, and faster RCN. It's a convolutional neural network algorithm. Many videos and many images were used. There is what we call as a darknet architecture. So there are 2 ways to look at it. One is the arbitrary units. So we determine certain changes in the pixel intensity based on the images across the ear, snout, ear postures, and then put a specific label number and then determine. Another way is in collaboration with ethologists and behavioral scientists. We show them videos, we explain the context, and then they give a label. Okay, it's excited, frustrated, potentially feared. So some of those emotional labeling. And then we train our algorithm based on this. There are 2 types of training of algorithms. And then we show the model and unseen data. We train some data, and then we have a new set of data we show, and then the model picks up, okay? And then we test how accurate the model is telling with respect to the gold standard and the other types of physiological, biochemical data we have collected. Here, just a video demonstration. So we can see the pig lying on a sand, and then once there is a person going closer, it gets a bit aggressive. This is a video of a cow taken that also shows the change in the intensity of the emotion. That's also very crucial. So we have labeled some of these 5 or 6 emotions, actually 13 different emotions we were able to assess based on the information available. Here we can see positive emotions, negative and aversion, alert and neutral, how they demonstrate aggression, or in a happy mood, and so on and so forth. So it's a work in progress, much more need to be done. We are also further validating with a large data set for additional future studies. So with this demonstration, I would like to thank the Welfare Council for Dairy Cattle, Kate from Wisconsin, and Daniel for giving this opportunity to connect with you. I'm sorry, it's midnight here, so I am connecting through a pre-recorded meeting. I hope I was able to provide a bit more new information in terms of determining emotions in dairy cattle. Thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful weekend. Bye.